There's only 4 sides to it. I think I've got it. Is that right? Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming on this lovely afternoon. I'll tell you what our purpose is this afternoon, and it is really simply to demonstrate that the Bible is a book that can be thoroughly trusted everywhere. I'm not trying to prove that it is God's infallible revelation, which I happen to believe it is. That rests on other premises. But today we're concerned to show that wherever you can check the Bible, you can trust it. And therefore, where you can't check it, you may still trust it. And that's really the theme of what we're doing. And we're doing it actually through the medium of archaeology. A big word, which some of you may have difficulty spelling, but it's really simply talking about rubbish. Yesterday's rubbish, the leftovers of previous civilizations. And yet it's extremely important. Professor Wiseman once said to me, archaeology correctly understood always confirms the accuracy of the Bible. And we're going to do it by looking at some people and events who some thought never existed. And that's the key. These are all people who some thought, some critics, some scholars thought never existed until evidence proved otherwise. Now we're going to move very fast. It doesn't look as though many of you have come planning to take notes, and if you were, I would say don't bother, because I'm going to move a bit too fast for you to do that, and I'll tell you what you can do about it to bring everything back into your memory at the end. Let's go back, not quite to the beginning, but close to the beginning. Come on in and do find a seat. Parking is so atrocious around here, isn't it? People are bound to come late, they can't help it. You're very welcome. Let's go back to the flood, the global flood. And whatever you think about it, remember the prophet Isaiah and Jesus and the apostle Peter in the New Testament, Isaiah in the Old, all believed in a global flood. But more than that, and what is interesting is that a catastrophic flood is found in the ancient traditions of nations right across the world. You can see them there on the screen. And in fact, on every continent except Antarctica, there are records of a global flood. There are 2 particularly that sound very close to the biblical record. One is called the Atrahasis epic, and the other is the Gilgamesh epic. We haven't time to look at both. A quick glance at the Gilgamesh epic. This is what you're looking at is the story told on a clay slab. It's one of the prize exhibits, as it happens, in the British Museum, dated around about 650 BC, but it's believed to be a copy of a much older account. And the account, in short, goes like this. Gilgamesh meets up with a guy called Utnapishtim. He wants to find eternal life. And Utnapishtim says, well, I found it because the god En-Ea told me that he was going to destroy the whole of mankind. I was told to build a big boat, which he did. It was a big 6-decker, which of course would have been completely useless in a storm. It would have fallen right over. And he took representatives of the animals into this big boat. He weathered out a storm that was so severe that even the smaller gods were afraid. And it lasted 1 week. He sent out a dove, a swallow and a raven, and in his case the raven didn't come back, and he got out of the boat on dry land and made offerings to the gods. Now those of you who know the biblical story can see a few wobbly links in there. Clearly this is a part of a tradition that goes right back in the beginning of time. And just as an aside, if you're interested and ever out in Kentucky in America, you can go to the Answers in Genesis site there, the Ark Encounter, and see, built by naval architects to the full descriptions of the biblical record, a full-sized ark to demonstrate that it really could have floated, really could have carried a huge number of animals, just 2 families or 1 family on board, and enough to last them for many months. It's a marvelous place to go if you can. So the evidence for a flood, leaving aside any geological things, and that's not my subject here, but the evidence for a flood is that there are stories about it all over the world. And in fact, many of the Babylonian and Chaldean king lists have pre- and post-flood as part of their records, their genealogies, and that in itself is interesting. Moving on from that, we come to the first major character after, of course, the creation of Adam and Eve, and that is Abraham. Abraham. The problem with Abraham is that we don't actually have any evidence of him from the world of archaeology. He's around 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. But excavations at Mari, which was the ancient capital of the Ammonite Empire, and the Ammonites are mentioned very widely in the Bible. And the inscription disc that was found there when the capital was discovered, it contained many, many documents, about 20,000 clay documents. And these are the time of Abraham. A slightly different area, but close by. They were close neighbors of the area Abraham lived in. And there were many, many details that fit perfectly into the life of Abraham. For example, many Bible names are found there: Noah, Abram, Laban, Jacob, Gad, Dan, Levi. They're not the same people, but they show the names are contemporary. And many place names and customs found in the Bible fit perfectly with the customs that we know at that time. All of which is evidence of a Bible that fits its place. As you move through the chronological history of the Bible, whether it's in Mesopotamia or whether it is in Egypt or following that in Assyria or Babylon or Greece or Persia or Greece or Rome, and it's in all of these empires, always it fits perfectly. The customs, the words, the names, the historical setting, they're all there in the Bible. And that makes the Bible unique among all religious books. There is no other religion that has such a clear chronological order. I may be able to say more about that later. Sometimes you will hear people say, well, we know the Bible is wrong because in Genesis chapter 12, it talks about Abraham's camels, 2,000 years BC. But we know that camels were not domesticated until about 1,000 years after that. Well, that was yesterday's news. What you're looking at here is a clay seal rolled out over, it's a cylinder seal about the size of your finger, rolled out over clay, and you've got two, actually it's only one, but it's come out twice, two camels, Bactrian camels actually, with riders on them, and it's a seal impression showing domesticated camels around 1800 to 1650 BC, around the time of Abraham. Don't get the idea that Abraham came from a very... I may need to ask somebody to get me a glass of water. Oh, it's already here, thank you. You're one jump ahead of me. Don't get the idea that Abraham came from a very primitive society. He didn't. When Sir Leonard Woolley began digging up Ur of the Chaldees, the city where Abraham began his life, in the 1920s, that's when Sir Leonard Woolley was digging him up. That's round about 500 years before Abraham. Get that? Half a millennium before Abraham. 1/5 of the homes had writing material in them. They discovered that these people were familiar with algebra, geometry, and quadratic equations, whatever that is. All right? These were not primitive people at all. There were 2-story homes with some primitive plumbing, simple plumbing in them. That's the context that Abraham and Sarah came from. And what you're looking at the screen is an envelope. On the immediate left-hand side, you have the question, the letter, and it's been put inside the envelope, which is a top and a bottom of the seal. They seal it around, they pop it in a red letterbox, and off it goes. In other words, what we have is evidence of trade over a vast area. And there are many tens of thousands, I repeat, tens of thousands of these kind of documents, many not yet translated. So who knows what we may yet find. And these show that trade was going on. There are orders for items that they want. There are even complaints for the wrong delivery of the wrong order. It's Amazon in the ancient world. It's all part of the biblical background. Now, here's a people you may not have heard of, although, in fact, they're referred to some 40 times in the Old Testament. Abraham bought land for burying his wife Sarah from the Hittites. David's military officer Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, was a Hittite. I say they are mentioned regularly in the Old Testament. Problem: the only reference we had to them was in the Bible. And therefore, in the minds of many biblical critics, they never existed. They were a people made up by the storyteller in the Bible. And then in 1906, the capital of the Hittites, Hattusis, was found. These people are a people known to have risen to their ascendancy of power about 1700 BC, and it began to, their height of their power was in 1400 BC, and then gradually tailed off for various reasons. What we do know about them is that they fought a very major battle with Ramesses II. Now, if you go in the British Museum, as many of you have, how many of you have been to the British Museum? Okay, you remember the big guy in the Egyptian room? That's Ramesses II. And he fought a battle against the Hittites. It was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. It was a very major contest, and they fought themselves to a standstill until they all ran out of puff, and it led to one of the first world-known peace treaties. So that was between Ramesses II and the Hittites. What you're looking at behind the screen there are some Hittite prisoners that have actually been taken from that battle. When he went back home, close to what is now the Aswan High Dam, he built this great temple to signify his victory over the Hittites. No one questions the Hittites today. When you go inside, and unfortunately you're not allowed to take pictures inside, you've got a picture of Ramesses clobbering all these Hittites, the people who once never existed. But now no one doubts the Hittites. Now, I need to tell you that many critics of the Bible believe that the whole of your Old Testament part of the Bible, from Genesis all the way through to the time of David and Solomon, and then they stop about there, all of that they believe was made up by Jewish scribes. It's a kind of made up story when the Jews were in exile in the 5th century BC. And all of that is not historically true. It's simply a made-up story. That has been believed for many years by many critics of the Bible. And therefore David, King David, was not a great warrior, not a great king. He was a mythological figure. Well, that was until the Tel Dan inscription was discovered, and incidentally there are more as well, but I'm only focusing on this one, Tel Dan inscription. It was discovered in 1993, and the king Hazael of Syria, and he's mentioned in the Bible incidentally, tells how he defeated the people in the north, the Israelites, and he defeated the house of David, or the dynasty of David. So what's special about that? Well, what is special is that it is only 175 years after David, but 300 years before the story was supposedly made up. No one today doubts the existence of David. Of course, they don't believe he's a great king. They say he's just a kind of tribal leader, because they've got to diminish their claims as the evidence demonstrates otherwise. Moving on to Solomon, do you remember the name of the queen who came to visit him? The Queen of Sheba. Now, she's another mythical character, of course. Now, it is true that we don't have Sheba as mentioned. We haven't found her. But the problem was, you see, Sheba is about 1,400 miles from Israel. And how would she have ever heard of Solomon? And why would they be bothering to come all that journey, 1,400 miles, a long journey then, to come and visit him? Well, this 6th century bronze Aramaic inscription reveals that there was constant trade between Sheba, and the towns of Judah. The towns of Judah are actually mentioned on the document you're looking at in front of you. Sheba is mentioned in the book of Job, in Psalms, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, and it is quite clear that trade was going on all that time. Now, we don't have the Queen of Sheba mentioned specifically, but we know that trade was going on. There was nothing unusual about her coming to visit Solomon. So that's Abraham, that's David, that's the Queen of Sheba and the Hittites. What about this guy? It's the one on your left that I'm talking about. This is Sargon, king of Assyria. Now, he's only mentioned in one verse in the Bible, Isaiah 20 and verse 1, and therefore, you've got it, he didn't exist either, because we knew nothing about a Sargon until the middle of the 19th century. And then when Paul-Émile Borter, a French archaeologist, was digging around in the area of what we know today of Iraq, he discovered Sargon's great capital city. And in 1843, this whole city was coming, as it were, out of the ground. This is the king who never lived. He's now one of the best-known kings of the ancient world. The Bible always demonstrates itself sooner or later. This king, incidentally, guarded his palace by two 10-ton, 15 feet high winged human-headed bulls, which wasn't bad for a king who never existed. His palace contained 240 rooms, and it was on more than one level. And as I say, it contained thousands of documents as well. Oh, and the guy he's looking at is probably Sennacherib, his son. We'll come to him in a moment. But before we leave Sargon, it's important to notice this. One of the things that Sargon records on the clay in front of you is the defeat of Samaria, the capital of Israel, in the north. By this time, Israel had separated from Judah. Israel settled with its capital in Samaria in the north. Judah was left with the capital of Jerusalem in the south. And Sargon records his defeat of Samaria, the capital, in the north. He actually says they took away 27,290 inhabitants and settled therein from countries that I myself had defeated. In other words, he did what all the ancient kings did, bar one, and we'll come to him before we finish. He did what they all did. They took the cream of the population out and they put other people in, so it diluted the possibility of opposition to their rule. Now, this is exactly what is recorded in 2 Kings chapter 17 and 18. And the problem is, do come in and join us. Afraid you're going to have to come towards the front, but don't worry about that. You won't end up on the screen, so it's okay. These people brought their gods with them. And the people in the north, in Israel, based on Samaria, began to imbibe, suck in the worship of these false gods. And that is why the people in the south, in Jerusalem, never got on with the people in the north, in Samaria. So when you read John 4 and verse 9, the Jews do not associate with Samaritans, always remember it was the fault of Sargon II, as it happens, Sargon, the king of Assyria, 700 years before Christ was born. I said he was chatting up his son, Sennacherib. It could be one of the courtiers, but it's more likely to be one of his sons. Now, when Sennacherib took over from his father, he set out to deal with the southern part of the country. And the king on the throne at that time was Hezekiah, one of the best kings of Judah, actually. Great spiritual revival in his time. But Sennacherib had not been paid his rent from Hezekiah, and it was time for him to get it back. So he brought his huge army sweeping right through the land of Judea. It's recorded in the Bible, but what you're looking at right here is not the Bible comment, but Sennacherib's own comment. And he says, as to Hezekiah the Jew, let me interject and say, how often old ancient manuscript documents, texts, refer to biblical kings. There's many of those. As to Hezekiah the Jew, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities and their forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity. His huge army wound up outside the second most important city in the whole of the south, and that was the city of Lachish. And when he arrived at Lachish, he set about sieging it and eventually broke in. When he went back to Nineveh, his capital, he'd moved his capital away from Sargon's fortress. When he went back to Nineveh, he demonstrated his victory by a whole series of wall plaques, something like 20 meters, 30 meters of wall plaques. If you've been to the British Museum and you've been to the Lachish room, that's what you were looking at. It's absolutely amazing. It was world news, international news, when this city was dug out of the ground in 1847, discovered by Austin Henry Laird, a British archaeologist. And here's this Bible story coming out of the ground. I could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about this because it deals with the whole episode, right from the very beginning of the lineup of the army, every stage of the battle to the end of the battle when the city is defeated and the leading men of the city are literally being flayed alive in front of their families. It's a very gruesome one, but it's all the way through. This is how we know what ancient battering rams were like. I could talk about that, but we haven't got time. And then early form of crucifixion, when the Assyrians would put a stake through a man's groin or his stomach and leave him to die. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Hezekiah had something like 4 years, because it took a long time for this big army to trundle all the way through the land, of warning, knowing what was coming. And he had to deny water to the enemy that would lay siege to Jerusalem, but also keep plenty of water within the city. And to do this, the Bible says he channeled the water down on the west side of the city of David, the tunnel by which he brought water into the city. To achieve this, they tunneled 49 feet below the surface, 533 meters, 533 meters winding underneath the city, and believe it or not, they met in the middle. Archaeologists have no idea how they did this today. The water dips by 0.06%, so it's just a gentle flow from the Kidron Valley outside into the city. We know they met in the middle because they left a plaque on the wall in which they actually described the point at which the two tunnelers coming pickaxe to pickaxe. If you walk through that, anybody walk through? Yeah, good. Matt has, a few of you have. I hope you didn't have too much water there. It was only over ankles when I was there. But you can see how tall it is. A person can walk through it. And all you have is a chisel, a hammer, and a little lamp to guide you. No one knows how they did it. But did it, they did. And they ended up in the pool of Siloam, which in itself was only uncovered in the year 2004. Now, the prophet Isaiah had said to Hezekiah and the people in the city, "This is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. He will not enter this city." And if you know the end of the biblical account, during the night, a larger part of his army was killed by an unknown hand. He returned back home. That's where he built the Lachish wall because he didn't get into Jerusalem. And a couple of decades later, he was assassinated by two of his sons. both of them named in the Bible, incidentally. But when he went back home, on this Taylor prism, he gives a record of all his great military exploits, but he does not mention that he got into Jerusalem. All he says was that he shut up Hezekiah in the city like a bird in a cage, which was really an admission that he never achieved. And of all the kingdoms that he defeated, and there were many of them, he got every single king out of his city except Hezekiah. That is simply a fact of history. Interestingly, on this clay prism, because after the Assyrians came the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar, who's mentioned in the Bible, came against the city twice, in 587 and 597, or to put it the proper way around, 597 and then 587 BC. This is a Babylonian chronicle. It's part of the diary, if you like, of the Babylonians. And it gives you the precise date when they actually conquered Jerusalem. It says that they arrived on the 16th of March, 597 BC. Now, the date is not given in 2 Kings, but it is given here. Again, another indication of how closely tied to reality and history is the biblical record. Now, here's a fascinating part, because when he arrived the second time in 587, he took the king Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. That's Jehoiakim, not Jehoiakim. That was confusing. Jehoiakim to Babylon, and with his family. And believe it or not, and you will believe it because everything I'm telling you is true, the food ration for Jehoiakim and his family, king of Judah, whilst in exile, has been found. And here is the food ration for that Jewish king, that Judaic king, when he was in exile in Babylon. No one's really doubted Jehu, king of Israel. Jehu, remember him? He's the one who invented Formula One. Do you remember? He drove his chariot furiously, the Bible says. He was a butcher and a murderer as well, destroyed the entire household of Ahab, as the Bible records. But he needed a few friends, and who better to get on side than Shalmaneser III, and one of the kings, big king of Assyria. And on this black basalt obelisk, the second row down tells us that it was the king of the house of Omri, Jehu, the house of Omri, that came and brought tribute to the king. This is the only picture we have, the only model we have, the only carving we have of a Judaic king. And that comes from the Assyrians. The Jews, of course, would never make an image of their kings because they were forbidden by the law of God to do so. In addition to this kind of evidence, you have these seal impressions. They're called a bulle. It's a flat seal. This is unlike the cylinder seal, just a little flat seal that might be very small, actually, about as big as your ear or even the big as the palm of your hand, and it's slapped down on a piece of a clay, and that's really your ID card. That's like putting it in the machine and you pull it out again and you've left the impression of the money you've just spent. And that's what these were for. There's one here, and it says, it has on it Ahaz, king of Judah. Another one, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And even one that is the belonging to Berechiah, the son of Neriah the scribe. Now, Berechiah was the scribe to Jeremiah, and he's mentioned about 40 times in the book of Jeremiah. Now, there are many more like this. I'm only giving you these three. But how interesting that we even have the clay seals of some of the kings of Judah. Going back to the people who once never existed, we have this one, Belshazzar. Belshazzar is only mentioned in the book of Daniel, nowhere else, and he didn't exist. And the problem also is compounded because the Bible says he was the king of Babylon when the Persians broke in the year 539. But we know that Nabonidus was actually the king in Babylon at that time, not Belshazzar. So the Bible's got it wrong. Well, not quite. That was until this clay cylinder was found. It's a barrel, really. It's only about so long. And on it, there's a prayer by Nabonidus, the king, for Belshazzar, the son of my heart. So at least we now know that Belshazzar existed and he was related to Nabonidus the king. So why was he the king? The answer is very simple. Nabonidus was actually away fighting battles in Arabia. And so the young upcoming prince was put on the throne to act in his place. So he was the king in the place of Nabonidus at the time the Persians broke in. It fits together perfectly. And that's why the Bible says that the night when the Persians broke in, they killed the king. That was Belshazzar. So his feast only lasted one night, and the next day he was killed. And they caught up with Nabonidus later. All that fits perfectly. So we are looking at people and events that never existed. A global flood, Abraham, the Hittites, David the king, Sargon of Assyria, Sennacherib his son, Belshazzar of Babylon. Well, let me correct, no one doubted Sennacherib. I just told you about him as an addition because there's lots of interesting parts to his story. Here's an instruction that was never given. You see, when the Persians broke in to Babylon, the Persian Empire now expanded, and Cyrus was the king of Persia. And he did something none of the ancient kings ever did. He had a change of mind. The Bible says, this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Anyone among you, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. In other words, he said, not just to the Jews, but to all the nations under his command, you can go back to your own city, you can rebuild your city, you can rebuild your temples, and you can even take your gods with you. And critics for years said, that's nonsense. They never did that. It worked the other way. They took people out. That's how people like Daniel and Ezekiel ended up in Babylon. Well, again, that was until a clay barrel was discovered. In 1879, the siren cylinder was discovered. It is still an icon of Iran. It is a hugely valuable item. It's been all on tour around the world, sits in a glass case in the British Museum. And this is exactly what is recorded on it. Not the Jews, he doesn't include the Jews here, but he does include all the other nations. He doesn't mention all the nations under his control, but many of them. You can all go back, you can rebuild your cities, you can take your gods with you. And the Bible tells how he said to the Israelites, you can take your gods with you. And they said, we don't have any gods, but I tell you what we would like. We'd like all the things that belong to the temple that Nebuchadnezzar stole from us. And he said, you can take those as well. You can read that story in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, just before we quickly switch to the New Testament, I want to introduce somebody to you, Professor Robert Dick Wilson. Now, Professor Robert Dick Wilson was what I call an armchair archaeologist. He didn't dig around in the ground, but he did do a great deal of study. He was actually a professor of Semitic philology at Princeton Theological University. Semitic philology sounds very good. Don't worry about it. It is very clever. And he learned a few languages to aid his research. They're up on the screen. Run your eyes down. Can't actually see French and Spanish among it, but he studied it for 15 years, every single language connected with the ancient documents of the Middle East and the Far East. Well, not the Far East, but the Middle East. 26 languages and dialects. Then he spent the rest of his academic life studying and lecturing on all the documents that were available. And this was his conclusion. He said, "I try to give my students such an intelligent faith in the Old Testament that they will never doubt them as long as they live. No man knows enough to assail the truthfulness of the Old Testament." That's a man who knew what he was talking about. The history of the Old Testament is a preparation for the presence of Jesus, the Messiah, in Israel 2,000 years ago. And the New Testament is the record of the fulfillment of this. What's just popped up on the screen is what they call a product placement. I'll tell you about it later. When the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. I'm going to introduce you to somebody else, not an archaeologist, a lawyer, Simon Greenleaf. When we turn over our Bible from Malachi to Matthew, you've turned over 400 years. A lot was going on in that 400 years, but that's not our subject this evening. Simon Greenleaf was one of the founders of the Harvard Law School in the USA in the 19th century, and he wrote a treatise, a 3-volume treatise on the law of evidence. If you're a lawyer here, you may have come across that because it is still used as a basic book. It's called the greatest single authority in the entire literature of the legal profession, according to the Dictionary of American Biography. And he turned his attention at one point to the 4 Gospels and set out, among others, five demands of any piece of literature. You write a letter, this governs your letter. Documents have a right to be taken as a true record unless proven otherwise. So that if you write your letter, I have to prove it's not yours, it's a forgery. Otherwise it stands, it belongs to you. More than that, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy until proven otherwise. If I know you always to be an honest person, I've got to prove that this one is a lying letter. I can't simply take it for granted. The number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. We have a detective amongst us here, and he'll identify with all of this because, well, what do you look for? Why do we have these notices? Anybody seen this accident? Anybody witnessed this? The more we get, the better we can form a picture. Isn't it interesting? Had God given us just one gospel, what would the critics say? Well, that's just one man's view. How can you tell that? Instead, he's given us 4 independent gospels, in fact 5, because Paul gives a whole chapter on the resurrection. And what do they say? The critics spend all their time trying to find differences among them. But the number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. The agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. And their reliability is confirmed by known events. Now, if you haven't already done that, let me do the answers to you. The 4 Gospels have never been proven inaccurate, ever. The writers were known men of integrity. They were not liars. They gave their lives for the truth of what they claimed. There are 4 independent Gospels, not 1, 4. They never contradict each other. And it's interesting that they present very often the same account from a different perspective, but they are not contradictory. You may want to pick that up in question time. And their historical details are confirmed by known history. I'll show you that in a moment. Luke, who incidentally has written just over a quarter of your New Testament, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. That forms about a quarter, just over 27% of your New Testament. In his Gospels and Acts, he refers to 114 identifiable places, always in the right place and the right time and the right name. 25 political, military, social, and religious events, all of which we can confirm. He refers to the famine in Judea, Acts 11, and the expulsion of the Jews from Rome under the Roman Emperor Claudius in Acts 18, both found in first century texts outside of the Bible. And he refers to 117 living people by name. Now, we don't know them all because some of them are people that just were there in that time and they've gone. But many of them are well known. For example, you may have forgotten, but in your Bible, your New Testament, there are 7 Herods. That's very confusing. 7 Herods. He mentions them all in exactly the right place, with the exact right jurisdiction and correct names. He is a very, very accurate historian. In fact, so accurate that he must have had a notebook. You say, a notebook in the first century? Yes, a notebook in the first century. Here is a first century notebook. Now, here's a good idea. Take a few slithers of parchment, leather if you like, or very thin slithers of wood, punch a hole in the bottom and put a ring in them, and you've made a ring binder. Now, that was a new piece of technology in the first century, and the Christians were quick to latch onto it. In fact, did you know Paul used a notebook? You see, the Greeks didn't have a name for this piece of technology, so they nicked the Latin name membrane, membrane. And when Paul writes to Timothy and says, Timothy, among all the other things, will you be sure to bring me the scrolls and the parchments? That word parchment in your Bible is a translation of the Latin word membrane. Paul was using a notebook. And Luke, I think, had a notebook. He was a very careful historian. You all know who this is, Caesar Augustus. Now, Caesar Augustus, as you know, issued a decree. It was a census that should be taken through the entire Roman world, the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his own town to register. Again, critics move in, nonsense. Number one, the Romans didn't take regular censuses. Well, we can dismiss that immediately. We now know that they did. Number two, can you imagine the upheaval if every time you had to fill in a census form, you had to go back to where you were born to do it? Nonsense. Well, that's exactly what the governor of Egypt demanded in AD 104 in the time of the Emperor Titus. A census order from the Roman governor of Egypt in the time of Trajan, ordering all men to return to their homes for a census. So the Bible, again, is proved even on that Christmas story to be true. Oh, by the way, I slipped in this for the ladies, really. The wife of Augustus was Livia. She became the kind of fashion icon of the day. She had a hairstyle that was called the nodus. She had a little knot at the front and a bun at the back joined by braided hair. And all over the empire there were little statues of young girls that have followed Livia. Now, don't feel guilty, ladies, if any of you've got a nodus or a plait or a braid or a bun or whatever. But remember what the apostle said: the beauty of the woman is not the outward adorning, but the inward person. Her stepson was Tiberius, and he was the emperor at the time when Jesus was in his teenage years. One of his officers, of course, was Pontius Pilate, and we know a lot about Pontius Pilate. He began in AD 26. It ended in disgrace 10 years later for mishandling the affairs in Judea. And both Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Philo, the Greek historian, they both refer to Pilate's mismanagement of affairs in Judea. And the story of Jesus' arrest and trial and crucifixion is a classic case of that. The inscription that you see there is found in Caesarea, which was the military headquarters on the coast, and it was 70 miles from Jerusalem. But I want to take you on quickly to the life of Saul. Saul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle. He's the one who stood by and watched Stephen being stoned to death, something that he never forgot, and called himself the foremost of sinners. There are two little accounts that you may not know the background to, and they're important and significant. You remember when he and Barnabas wound up in Lystra, the crowd saw what Paul had done in healing a man, and they came out and showered them with garments and bowed down and called them gods, and you had a job to stop them worshipping. Why did they do that? Well, there's a story behind it. The legend was told of the time when Jupiter, chief of all the Roman gods, he's Zeus to the Greeks, was ready to destroy mankind because nobody was very generous. Came to Lystra, where Paul and Barnabas now are, with Mercury. He's Hermes to the Greeks, and he's the messenger who leads people after death. They dressed as weary travelers, and every door was shut, except two very common poor people. And Philemon and Baucis welcomed them in, and the city was spared, and they were rewarded. And when Paul and Barnabas came and did wonderful miracles, they thought, the Greeks have come, the gods have come again. We'd better not miss out on this opportunity. And they wanted to welcome them, and they had a job to stop them. That's the story behind it. Paul would have known that story. Barnabas would have known that story. And then when they came to Athens, there was a similar story behind what they found there. You remember Paul said, I've been all around the city, and I found an altar to the unknown God. Now, it was well known that Athens was so full of gods that somebody once said it's easier to find a god in Athens than a man. Altars everywhere. And some of them were to an unknown God. Story behind that, which Paul would have known, is that the city was named after the goddess Athena, we know that, who lived in Parthenon on the Acropolis up on the hill. And in Greek folklore, Athens was suffering from a terrible plague. They'd tried all their gods, cried out to them all and worshipped them all and rewarded them all, and nothing stopped the plague. And so somebody said, you really need to send to Epimenides. Epimenides, he comes from Crete, and we all know what the Cretians are like. They're liars and they're awful people, brutes people. We don't want them. It's the only hope you have. They get him to come along, and he tells them that they have to make certain offerings. We needn't go into the detail of that. The plague stopped. And they said to him, well, we got to worship. Well, what can we do now? Well, how can we repay you? And he said, well, all I want is a peace treaty between Crete and Athens, and I will not tell you the name of the god who did this wonderful miracle. And so they made an altar to the unknown God. And altars to the unknown God were not just in Athens, but all over the place, just in case you missed one out. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it shows the background. You see, archaeology doesn't only authenticate, but it often illustrates the biblical account. If I can take you for a moment to the ruins of Corinth. If you go to the ruins of Corinth today, outside the ruins there is a pavement, and on one of the pavements is the inscription that this was built by Erastus, the city treasurer, and he built the pavement, the long pavement, at his own expense. Well, interestingly, when Paul is writing to the church at Rome, he is writing from Corinth, and he sends greetings from the city. Well, he doesn't call him the city treasurer, he calls him the director of public works, which is a very similar position. Could this be the same Erastus as the one in the Bible? It was a high-ranking office. We can't be certain, but the two would easily tie up. Similarly, on the Isle of Patmos, on the Isle of Cyprus, the leader Paphos was the governor, Paulus, and we have found reference to him as well. There's no question that he belonged exactly where he was. Luke is careful to give city leaders their correct title. We have town councils, don't we? They're all over the country. They're all called town councils. Well, not so in the time of Luke. In Philippi, they're called strategoi. In Ephesus, they're called asiarchons. In Malta, they're called the protos, or he's the one in charge. In Thessalonica, they're called the politarchos. And Luke gets the right name for the right people in the right place wherever he goes. And this is simply an inscription of the politarchs. The first word in this inscription is the politarchunton, and that's at Thessalonica. When Paul caused a riot in Jerusalem, poor Trophimus was the center of attention. He was a Greek, and the false rumor went around, fake news, that Paul had taken him into the forbidden area, into the temple courts, which Paul would never have done. But the news went round and it caused a terrible riot, because there was a demarcation line beyond which no Gentile, non-Jew, should ever come. In 1871, this notice, carved in stone and written in Greek for Jews, was discovered in Jerusalem. It was originally painted red. Some of the pigmentation was there. And if we can translate the Greek into English, it read, "No foreigner may pass the barrier and enclosure surrounding the temple. Anyone who is caught doing so will himself be to blame for his resulting death." And that is exactly what Paul had in mind when he wrote to the Ephesians in Ephesians 2 and said, when Jew, Gentile become Christians, Jesus has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. Even in his military comments, Luke gets it exactly right. When Paul was sent from Jerusalem to Caesarea, you remember the Jews planned an ambush. The plot was uncovered, and the Roman governor decided to send a strong party, I think a bit over the top, but maybe some of the men were simply due for leave and they were swapping round. And there were three groups to it. The escort to Caesarea, 200 heavy cavalry infantry. The 70 cavalry, 200 lightly armed spearmen. That is exactly the three divisions of the Roman army. And have you noticed how often, how accurate Luke is? He often gives you not only the name of the centurion in charge, but sometimes even the regiment he belonged to. And so to Rome. And here we're going to close. Julius was sent a centurion of the imperial cohort. Now these were cohort of officer couriers for communications between the emperor and the army. And he was given the authority of taking Paul, along with a load of other prisoners, to Rome. This is the kind of boat, ship, whatever you want to call it, that he would have been in. That's what would have been plying between the various stations to keep in touch with Rome. Now here is something fascinating, and you may never have discovered this. On that journey to Rome, every detail fits perfectly the account of an eyewitness. A man called James Smith was 60 years a professional sailor, educated at Glasgow University, a scholar in Greek, Latin and many languages, a student of geology, archaeology, and specifically an authority on ancient ships and shipping. In 1848, he published a book called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. There are 370 pages of it, but don't worry, you don't have to read it all because most of it is about shipping of the time. But he had done an immense amount of work on every single detail, climactic, the weather, the geography, the words that are used, every detail of the whole of Paul's journey to Rome. And he gave this account, and it's considered to be the finest piece of eyewitness account of a shipwreck ever recorded and accurate in every detail. That's the journey of Rome to Rome. This is what he said, and it's worth reading in full. No sailor would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. However, and Luke was a physician, a doctor, not a sailor, no man not a sailor could have written the narrative of the sea voyage so consistent in all its parts unless from actual observation. This peculiarity of style is to me in itself a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by an eyewitness. A similar remark may be made on the geographical details. They must have been taken from an actual observation. You remember the details talk about the island, it talks about the depth of the sea. Nobody could make that up and could get it correct as it was checked today. They must have been taken from actual observation, for the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. Let me close that by saying Luke's account and Smith's detailed analysis are of the greatest significance. If this is the character of Luke as a historian, then his gospel and the rest of Acts must be held with equal respect. Sir William Ramsay, one of the greatest archaeologists of the New Testament ever, said, "You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. You cannot test that archaeologically. It is a matter of faith. He was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. If that is true, it demands a response from every one of us. If you go, as some of you will have been, to the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, that's not the tomb Jesus was buried in, but it's very like it. If you go in and turn around and come out, when I was there at least, this is what you see on the door as you come out. He's not here, for he is risen. The resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. I'm going to close there, but I want to mention two of the books, and then I'll hand it over to Matt to chair from there on the question time, and he can answer all the questions while I go and sit down here. The first one is Evidence for the Bible, and the other is Background to the Bible. And as you've heard, these are both sold in the British Museum. They are, and you can thumb through them here, they are beautiful coffee table books. And in the first book, we have tried, myself and my colleague have tried to ransack the museums and dig sites across the world to bring you the best. And they're the kind of things I've been giving you here, but done in such a way that is very easy to read. You never have to turn a page in the main part of the book to finish an article. One page, one article, next page, next article. Apart from the end when there are some longer articles. So if you want to make sense of how many people really left Egypt in the time of Moses, if you want to make sense to that conundrum about Quirinius and the censuses, you'll find answers to that in slightly longer but easy to read articles. An easy book simply, and that's why they're coffee table books, pictures on every single page. You can just thumb through it. Background to the Bible takes you behind the scenes. So if you want to know about child sacrifice in the ancient world and sadly adopted by the Israelites, you'll find it there. If you want to know who these 7 Herods are and how you distinguish one from another, if you want to know why there's Annas and Caiaphas, both called the high priests, when there can only be one high priest at a time, you'll find it there. And I could go on and on. Easy to read, simple, many pictures on every page. I do commend them both to you. They sit comfortably side by side, and effectively, if you want them here, you can get 2 for just under the price of 1. No, that's not quite true. Yeah, all right. They're both less than half price, both of them less than half price. I think I'll stop there. Oh, the only thing I was going to mention, these little books, the latest in this series of 5. If you can't afford the price of the big books, they're £25 books that are sold here for 12. If you can't afford that, can you afford 50p for something like this? And there's one that talks about, is the Bible true? And the other is evidence for the Bible. So they effectively are potted versions of the big ones. This one has only just come out. What is the Bible all about? Are you a Christian? How would you answer the question, what is the Bible all about? I've never read the Bible. I don't know anything about it. And there are lots of people coming into our churches today like that. I don't know anything about the Bible. I don't know what books are. And I'm told there are 66 books in the Bible. How do they all fit together? This is the answer. In just a little booklet like that. How would you answer it? Because it's a question that is needed to be answered. And it will demonstrate how there is a beautiful theme running right through the Bible. It's not enough simply to say, I know what the Bible's all about. It's all about Jesus. Yeah, but why do you need such a big book to do that? Well, I suggest you get hold of a copy of that. Matt, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really helpful and informative presentation. Really enjoyed and appreciated. Now going to go on to the second part of today, which is the question and answer session. So if you do have a question for Brian, please do raise your hand. You'll be selected to ask that question. If I can ask that you just raise your voice, speak nice and loudly so everyone can hear, and then Brian will answer those questions. So who has a question to start with for Brian?
Don't worry, there is always a silence, and it's normally an opportunity when I threaten you that if you don't have any more, I'll put some more stuff in for you. So it's over to you. Is there anybody? Your question will be a good one, whatever it is. So don't worry, because it's a subject that not too many people know a great deal about. One thing I want to warn you about, and I'm only filling in, so while I'm talking, you can raise your hand and I will stop, all right? One of the things that I need to warn you about is when you're searching for things, you know this in other subjects, and it's true on this one. Be careful when you go online. You can go online and find many extravagant things said. One of the questions that is often asked is, have we found Noah's Ark? Well, I can tell you where to go online, and you'll find many articles where people claim to have found Noah's Ark. Don't get hung up on that. None of them have really sustained careful analysis. You can go and find a video in which people claim that they have found under the Red Sea coral-encrusted chariot wheels, demonstrating that they were the chariot wheels that came off the Egyptian chariots when they crossed the sea. The problem with that is that no one's been able, because understandably the Egyptian authorities won't let you bring coral up from the bottom of the Red Sea, and therefore you can't submit them to any kind of forensic examination. And so it's not possible to demonstrate whether they are or they're not. There is so much that is true, and everything I have told you today is accepted virtually universally. I could tell you one exception to that in my mind, but these things are all accepted. All those little bullae, the little prince of kings, that's all accepted. Even there were two actually from Baruch, the secretary to Nehemiah, and one of them has a thumbprint on it. We might even have the thumbprint of Nehemiah's secretary. But I don't tell you that because it's got to be somebody's thumbprint, but it needn't be his. It could be anybody's. It's just not yours, that's all. That's the only thing you can be sure about. So please be careful. Know where you're going. There are journals I take, the Biblical Archaeological Review, which is a thoroughly trustworthy review of what's going on in the archaeological world as far as the Bible is concerned. So when you find an article that they found a skull of somebody in Gath and there's a hole in the head where David's stone went in, just put it on one side and don't use it, because you'll be made to look stupid. That's just a word of warning. Any questions?
What piqued your interest in archaeology and these type of studies?
Yeah, we began by actually, we had a Genesis project on a Saturday morning in our church, and we gathered other churches around us to do this, and we would teach people, 30 Saturdays a year, 3 term times, and we were teaching a whole range of Bible subjects, including this subject. And it was then that we actually went up to the British Museum and showed people some of the things. And not everything I've shown you here is in the British Museum by any means. And that really sparked off a fact that we began taking people around the British Museum. And we have taken, I don't know how many of you have ever done one of the day one tours around the British Museum, but I don't do it anymore, and neither does my colleague Clive Anderson, but they still do. And many, I think Clive kept a careful record, and I stopped looking at his record when we realized we'd taken over 12,000 people around the British Museum. I did mean that, 12,000, but it's many more than that now. British Museum has about 6 million people a year visiting it, and that's why it's a very good thing for us to be able to have 3 books in the British Museum. 2 of them are the 2 on screen. The other one is the little book. Have we got some here, Rosie? Yeah, Through the British Museum with the Bible, which takes you around the British Museum, gallery by gallery, case by case, item by item, telling you what you're looking at and pitching it straight into the Bible. So lots of people go to the British Museum, they know it's got a lot of Bible things, but they don't know where on earth to start looking. You can actually do a tour with the book in your hand. So that's really how we got into it. I'm not a trained archaeologist, although Chris Sinkinson, who joined us for background to the Bible, he's more qualified from that. But you don't have to be a qualified archaeologist to read books on archaeology. Yes?
Many of the evidences that you mentioned were discovered and dug up in the 20th century. Are there any sort of current digs ongoing in areas that might find things that are related to the Bible in more recent history?
Yes, thank you. Good question. Most of those I've shown you, you said 20th century. Actually, 19th century is a bit more accurate. They're mainly in the 1800s. And the reason for that was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, I will answer your question, but the end of the Napoleonic Wars enabled there to be kind of peace around Egypt, and actually British and French archaeologists, I mentioned Austin Henry Laird and Paul Henry Borter, they are French and English, they could work together. Mind you, we sometimes nick things from them. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by a French officer, and we took it from him and brought it to London. So mainly in the 19th century, because that's when there was a sudden urge to dig up the past. A bit late, because many grave robbers had already got there. Now, what's going on today? The answer is a lot in a lot of places, particularly in Jerusalem. I indicated the Pool of Siloam was only uncovered in 2004. So there is a lot still going on, a lot still being found. They are doing, because they can now do wonderful technology that can fly a zone over an area of land and actually penetrate and pick out what lies beneath the surface. Egypt, Greece, they've got so much more to dig up, and they are. If you take, for example, also go to the city that Vesuvius, Pompeii, thank you, Pompeii, it went out of my head. 2/3 of Pompeii is still yet to be uncovered, and they're working on it right now and discovering a great deal. Now, you say, what's that got to do with the Bible? Well, in background to the Bible, we have a section in which it demonstrates that there were almost certainly Christians living in Pompeii at the time of the eruption. And it's very interesting how archaeologists, clever people, can sometimes be very dismissive. One archaeologist, well known in the area of Pompeii, Mary Beard, she actually has written a book on that. She mocks the idea and says, you know, that's fantasy. But think of this. When Paul arrived off the coast, just down the coast, he was 30 miles from Vesuvius, from Vesuvius and Pompeii. And in the town that he arrived at, there was a known Christian community because the Acts of the Apostles says so. And that was around 40, 45, 50 AD, just 20 years before Vesuvius erupted, or nearly 30 years. So there was a Christian community because he went and joined them. We know also, and this is a fact of archaeology, trade between Pompeii and the coastal town was regular. There's evidence for that in texts and so on. So the possibility of Christians in Pompeii, and it's more than that, there's evidence of crosses in Pompeii, there's a text on a wall in Pompeii still being discussed, and every time I see a new dig in Pompeii, I'm hoping somebody's going to come up with a definitive answer. It doesn't matter, honestly, it's not in the measure of the Bible authority, but I'm sure there were Christians there. It would be inconceivable they weren't, only a day's journey away from the coast where we know there were Christians. And Pompeii was a very, very significant town. Did that answer your question? Yeah, roughly. Thank you. All right. Look, I overshot time, I know, and I am going to be around, so you can come and talk to me if you want to browse the books, have a look at them, and purchase them. Rosie will help you. Just to remind you, we don't have a card reader, I'm afraid, but you can do a BACS transfer, and the details are there, or you can pay by a check, or what's the other one? You can pay with these things called coins, cash, you know. I wonder how many of you have got a coin on you, but anyway, you can pay in one of those three areas. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian.